Hello, and welcome to 10 Rural Churches, Boyd Barrett, the Kingdom of Heaven, and the Kingdom of Kerry, as part of this year's Architecture Kerry Festival 2022. My name is Peter Luddy, and I am an architecture graduate from Tralee. I have worked in practice in both Cork and Kerry over recent years. I also teach history and theory at the Cork Centre for Architectural Education, where my focus has been on 20th century modernism and housing. Having made a brief foray into development of Kerry's modernist architecture for last year's festival, I'm delighted to return and share with you a deeper exploration of some of Kerry's most modern church buildings over the next 45 minutes or so. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Aisling Dunn at the Irish Architecture Archive and Dr. Shane Lahan at the Kerry Diocesan Archives for their support, as well as Festival Director Victoria McCarthy for inviting me to return to this year's festival. There's a fantastic schedule of events planned, and I hope that you will all enjoy the celebration of Kerry's built environment. Kerry's architectural heritage spans many centuries. It offers an important reflection on the social, economic and cultural history of this place and its people. The ring forts, monastic sites, castles and estate houses dotted around the county, monuments to our earliest history, are undoubtedly our most renowned landmarks. However, our more recent architectural history, that of the 20th century, is often overlooked. Yet the buildings of this period are perhaps most significant in telling the story of our relatively young nation. Although time has been unkind, and many of these buildings have come to be renowned as old-fashioned, it is critical that we appreciate the legacy of these artefacts, once shiny and new, the epitome of all that was experimental, innovative and modern for the time. As we continue to celebrate the centenary of the formative years of the Irish state, it is important to acknowledge what contribution Kerry's modern architecture made to this foundational period. One of the most intriguing and clear transformations during the 20th century occurred in ecclesiastical architecture. For much of our history, the church, the state, and society as a whole have been inextricably entwined, and during the mid-century, church architecture became a site of contestation in the battle between tradition and progression. During the prosperous period of 1951 to 1961, a Cork architect by the name of James Rupert Boyd Barrett was challenged to design 10 new churches for the Kerry Diocese. This talk will explore how these buildings emerged and what they can reveal to us about the condition of architecture and society in Kerry during the mid-century. Through this local lens, we might also come to understand what was happening more broadly on a national and global level. The late 19th century and early 20th century was a tumultuous time as the world embraced the rapid growth of industry, the advancement of science and technology, and the glorification of all that was radically new. Humanity marched firmly in the direction of urbanization and modernization. New ways of thinking would reform worldviews on economics, religion, housing, and education, shifting the social landscape globally. The upheaval in society was mirrored by spatial change, as buildings responded to the evolving requirements of the modernizing world. Modern architecture broke from tradition and aspired to reflect the spirit of the time. Buildings would be executed on a scientific basis, often with an emphasis on function rather than form. Non-essentials were stripped away to maximize space and efficiency, and this abstract, stripped-back aesthetic would become more prevalent as the century progressed. Ireland, on the remote edge of Europe, was slower to embrace modernisation than its European counterparts. Consumed in the first 2 decades of the new century by the fight for independence, the young nation that emerged would continue to experience great social and economic hardship with cycles of recession, austerity and mass immigration. The Irish Free State, in its infancy, held limited financial resources and opted for a policy of prudence rather than risky experimentation. This philosophy would be reflected in the buildings of the time, as the evolution of architecture mirrors almost exactly the political forces at work in the emerging republic. The power vacuum left by the end of British rule in 1921 caused other changes in the social structure of the country. Though the Catholic Church had endured many challenges during the penal laws of the previous centuries, it found itself in a much revitalised position in this new era. A majority of the Irish populace looked to the Church for leadership and guidance, and it held a significant and authoritative role within the fledgling state. A progressive sentiment had underpinned the nationalist revolution, but having secured independence, Irish society returned to its fiercely traditional and Catholic values. De Valera and Fianna Fáil's victory in the 1932 election installed a willing partner for the church in the Dáil. The architect Simon Walker has suggested that the church and state colluded to keep the corruption of the pagan and foreign values of modernism off our shores. This is not explicitly true, however, as many new civic and industrial infrastructures began to embrace modern forms and materials. The state relied heavily on the church to share the mantle of patron of architecture, and the schools and hospitals it funded emerged as some of Ireland's most progressive new constructions. However, there is no doubt that Irish ecclesiastical architecture itself remained decidedly conservative during the 1930s and 1940s. The period after Catholic emancipation in 1829 had borne witness to a countrywide building boom, and on average 2 churches were built per week throughout the 19th century. It was also a golden dawn for church building in Kerry. The Diocese of Ardfert and Haddo, as it was then known, brought some of the most eminent architectural figures of the time to the county. Augustus Welby Pugin's St Mary's Cathedral in Clarny, J.J. McCarthy and George Ashton's St John's in Tralee, and Pugin and Ashling's Holy Cross Dominican Church, also in Tralee, are among the finest examples from this era. These were large and elaborate buildings. Older aesthetics and orders, such as the Romanesque, the Neoclassical, the Gothic Revival, and the Neo-Georgian, presented the opportunity to construct ornate and decorative buildings which might impart the wealth and status of the church. Furthermore, the monolithic use of heavy and severe stone masonry asserted the strength, power, and authority of that institution. The turn of the century ushered in change in Europe and a major break from tradition. Catholic denomination churches, such as the German example shown here, charted new and progressive approaches to the design of sacred spaces. Dominicus Boehm's fanciful constructions were widely expressionist, while others, like Schwartz's Corpus Christi, offered a new discrete form of minimalism. At home, there were the odd outliers. Barry Byrne's Christ the King Cork and McCormick and Cora's Our Lady and St Michael's in Ennistymon broke all conventions in Irish architecture and anticipated much later innovations. However, this potential progression was abruptly interrupted by the outbreak of World War II. Ireland's neutrality initiated a period of intense insularity and international isolation. Construction slowed to a trickle, and the economy remained in a fragile state throughout the 1940s, as Ireland slipped back into conservative fiscal and architectural tendencies. The historian Paul Larmer reports that church buildings, despite various attempts to introduce a modern architectural image, have been all but impervious to any such change of approach. The trends of the 19th century continue to serve as a touchstone for most renovations and new builds, such as Our Lady of Lourdes, Scartaglen, which was completed in 1930. This duality across the global Catholic Church illustrates the ambivalent attitude which they held for the development of architecture in the 20th century. A new era dawned as the Irish Free State transitioned to a republic in 1949, and a more diverse and open coalition government replaced Fianna Fáil. The country's fortunes altered drastically as it experienced a period of economic development and growth, and the cultural insularity of the previous decade was cast aside. This transformation would find its expression in a more modern architecture than heretofore, and even church architecture experienced a softening of hostilities. Although he was not native to Kerry, James Rupert Boyd Barrett was certainly one of the most active and prolific architects in the county, and in wider South Munster during the mid-century. He contributed much to the architectural landscape of the fledgling state during a career of almost 50 years. Boyd Barrett apprenticed with Jones and Kelly of Dublin before pursuing his professional education in architecture. The work of this office was firmly rooted in the revivalist styles of the 19th century. However, he established his own practice in Cork when he was only 24 years old, and worked on 2 projects of national significance early in his career. In 1927, the Chicago architect Barry Byrne was commissioned to design the new Church of Christ the King in Cork. His proposal featured an atypical open floor plan and a daring use of structure. Boyd Barrett was appointed as the supervising local architect, and he played an intrinsic part in the realisation of this radically modern building. It was he who suggested that Byrne's initial vision of brick construction be revised in favour of concrete, a move which not only made the project economically viable, but also cemented its revolutionary status and legacy. The seminal and futuristic Christ the King was the first concrete-built church in Europe and remains one of the largest suspended ceiling churches in the world. The second landmark project allowed Boyd Barrett to flex his own creative muscle. His 1935 competition-winning design for the new headquarters of the Department of Industry and Commerce in Dublin was one of the first and few purpose-built government buildings in the country. The material language and elevational composition balances the tentative architectural approach of the Free State with Boyd Barrett's own impulse for modernism. The traditional heavy facade of ashlar granite disguises a modern and light steel frame construction. Save for sculptural panels with depictions of industry and transport, the building remains largely unadorned. This is characteristic of the muted or truthful minimalism which had been inspired by the Bauhaus in Europe and the interwar Art Deco of New York. The National Inventory of Architectural Heritage had described the Kildare Street offices as perhaps Dublin's most iconic 20th century building. It certainly confirmed Boyd Barrett as one of Ireland's early state-building architects. Over the next 4 decades, Boyd Barrett was at the forefront of architecture in his adopted home of Cork. His firm provided designs for many new civic buildings, such as the Erinville Maternity Hospital and Cork Bus Station, as well as the engineering and science faculties and the new restaurant building on UCC campus. Boyd Barrett also played a pivotal role in the expansion of the city suburbs, designing large social housing developments at Grán na Brathair, Greenmount and Spangle Hill. However, his marquee commission came from Archbishop Cornelius Lucy of the Diocese of Cork and Ross. Under his direction, Boyd Barrett oversaw the construction of 4 of the 5 so-called Rosary churches during the 1950s. The earliest churches of the set certainly conformed with the neoclassical predilection of the time, holding on to traditional Latin cross or cruciform layouts and leaning on romanticised revivalist styles. In ecclesiastical architecture, Boyd Barrett had found his niche, and in the Catholic Church he had found a much obliging benefactor. In his book on Cork's most modern architect, Frank Murphy, the author Conor English suggests that Boyd Barrett was reputedly aided in this endeavour by relations within the church. He certainly enjoyed preferential treatment and the luxury of the bishop's patronage, in comparison to other architects like Murphy, who had to contend with interference and scrutiny from the diocese during the build process. In truth, Boyd Barrett experienced such relative ease because he was a safe bet for the church. He did not seek to break wholly from the mould and was content to stay true to the revivalist aesthetic he'd been accustomed to at Jones and Kelly. For this reason, the construction and renovation of religious buildings would form an important part of Boyd Barrett's oeuvre. Eventually, his expertise were also sought in the Diocese of Kerry. The prosperous 1950s witnessed an extensive programme of renovation and rapid construction as the church sought to maintain and strengthen its place at the heart of both rural and urban communities. Parallel to his work in Cork's diocese, Boyd Barrett was commissioned to design 10 new churches for the Diocese of Kerry, completing these works between 1951 and 1961. This initiative was begun under Bishop Michael O'Brien, but it intensified under the leadership of Bishop Dennis Moynihan. 2 new churches will be built in the marginal uplands and fertile farmlands of North Kerry. St Mary's, or the Sacred Heart, in Larracampán from 1956, and St Mary's of Assumption in Moyvan, also from 1956. 4 churches were constructed around the lakes, vales and foothills of Mid-Kerry. Our Lady of Perpetual Succour in Shrone from 1954, Our Lady of the Valley in the Gap of Dunloe from 1955, Our Lady of the Wayside in Clonkeen from 1958, and the Church of the Holy Spirit in Muckross from 1961. Finally, 4 more churches were proposed for the coastal parishes of the Iveragh Peninsula in South Kerry. These included St Finian's or the Sacred Heart of the Glen in Keele from 1952, Mary Immaculate in Foylmore from 1954, St Joseph's Ahatubrid from 1956, and finally, Church of the Most Precious Blood in Castle Cove from 1961. Although this campaign was smaller in scale than its city counterpart, it was no less ambitious and had an equally significant impact on the localities it provided for. While the Cork Rosary campaign had been a suburban experiment, strategically sited to serve the fast developing new communities on the city's outskirts, the Kerry project would be a truly rural challenge. These remote, agrarian communities, far from the seats of power and industry, had seen their way of life eroded in the previous century by the mechanisation of labour, the hardships of the Great Famine, and intense mass immigration. They continued to feel the hangover of austerity throughout the mid-century had been slow to absorb any real modernisation or advancement. Accessibility was a driving factor behind the provision of the new churches. A Riot documentary from October 1963 juxtaposed the waters and crags and woods and lakes, which make Kerry so attractive for the visitor, with the many headaches it creates for those who have to live among them. Long had these communities suffered in not having their own place of worship. On Sundays, mass-goers would scatter to churches in other parishes, which could be many miles away. In a time when motorised transport was scarce, this was an arduous journey, made all the more difficult by changing weather conditions and the pains of fasting. Residents of the Black Valley were lucky to get to church once a month, and pilgrims from the Clyde Valley, rising for early Mass, often had to stay overnight with family members in Kilgarvan, Ballyvourney and Rathmore. Meanwhile, the people of Castle Cove, trudging over the mountain to Caherdaniel, would find only standing room remaining as the local population had already occupied their seats. Yet, these devout and resilient people were not fazed. One parishioner in Clonkeen described the industrious spirit by which they commuted. Some cycled, others travelled by pony and trap, sidecar, or even the common car with the boards across the guards. Others again crowded Tom Fitzgerald's lorry and held on for dear life, while he negotiated Powellgurn Bridge and the sharp bends further on. Many of the localities sought small, modest spaces of worship. The new church at Castle Cove would accommodate a congregation of only 250 people. Other parishes sought to replace ageing and derelict buildings. Moyvan Church, the largest of the 10, proposed to seat 730 people, but it also needed to expand its congregation on dairy days when creamy suppliers flocked into the village. Capital was of course another key factor to consider. The small church at Clonkeen was amongst the cheapest of the set, costing £9,000 or approximately The small church at Clonkeen was amongst the cheapest of the set, costing £9,000 or approximately €210,000 in today's money, while the more extensive works at Moyvan peaked somewhere between £50,000 and £60,000, an estimated figure in excess of €1.3 million today. These figures did not account for internal fixtures and furnishings, or the pieces of sacred art and vestments required by the parishes. The fit out of the church throne, for example, amounted to an additional £2,000. Philanthropic acts offset some costs. Landlords often bequeathed sites or funds to the communities for the construction of churches. Other localities, such as Keele and Shrone, had received sizable donations from emigrants who had found wealth and success in England and the United States. Regardless of additional contributions from the diocese, the wider clergy, and the parish priests themselves, the majority of this building campaign was self-funded by the efforts of the communities. In a time when people were not well off, employment was scarce, and families were dependent on the modest farming incomes, the passion and faith of the people shines through. The Golden Jubilee booklet for Our Lady of the Wayside goes to great lengths to illustrate how the small community in Clonkeen rallied together. In addition to direct subscriptions from the congregation, the local people were mobilised to draw money from outside the parish. Football matches, dances, socials, and card games were organised to bring in gate receipts. Raffle books were distributed for locals to sell at carnivals, regattas, sports days and agricultural shows across Kerry, Cork and Limerick. The funding committee even took donations of potatoes and waste paper, which they could sell in markets at Cork City. Despite not having a single or direct source of funding, the small size of the projects and the fervent enthusiasm of the communities meant there was no significant delay in the building process, and many were completed within the space of a single year. An underlying principle of modernism was the search for an architecture of universal application, regardless of context. The scale and simplicity of these projects, using modular and standardised means of construction, allowed for more flexible arrangements of space, meaning that church designs could be replicated and rolled out across the county with relative ease. Boyd Barrett worked with a variety of local contractors across the campaign, such as Jeremiah Galvin and Sons from Sneem, or John McSweeney and Sons, and O'Neill and Carroll of Castle Island. However, the most interesting construction partnership came from the depths of the Black Valley. When local parish priest Father Pat Sears announced his intention to execute Boyd Barrett's designs on behalf of his 94 parishioners, he was met with great scepticism. A shortage of money and the remoteness of the area meant that no contractor would tender for the work. Where others saw constraint, Father Sears and his flock saw opportunity. The people of the valley, long used to fending for themselves, set to work in clearing a site. With no machinery, they flagged the river, blasted the rock with gelignite, and set out lines of men with spades to dig the foundations. A set of permanent workers were hired to begin constructing the walls, mixing cement for the concrete blocks at the nearby lakeshore. However, few other specialists were employed during this build. Father Sears himself combined the roles of foreman, builder, bricklayer and plumber, with his weekly duties as celebrant in Beaufort. A tractor and trailer were sent to the mouth of the valley 2 to 4 times a day to collect supplies and carry them back over 6 miles of Kerry Crag, rock and lakeside, contending with 1 and 5 degree slopes, bends and boulders along the way. The team worked from early dawn and late into night for a solid year and a half. As their dream became a reality and the first Angelus rang out in the valley, visitors noted that the faith and labour of priests and people in building the church give it a firmer and more lasting foundation than perhaps even the rocks of the gap themselves. It was critical that any new architecture inserted into the rural Kerry landscape would be considered of the traditions of place, the church and its people, but that it might also promote the optimistic outlook of the time. While Boyd Barrett's parallel work in Cork continued in neoclassical styles, the smaller builds of the Kerry campaign presented a less risky opportunity to experiment. Boyd Barrett's modest buildings demonstrate a conscious turn away from the dominant and ostentatious church architecture that preceded them. Aside from the much larger church at Moyvan, which held onto a traditional Latin cross arrangement with additional entrances at the transept, each church comprised of a simple rectangular layout with a single entrance from the rear of the nave. A number of his designs, such as Castle Cove, broke from the rigid symmetry of the past and had off-centred narthex, or entrance porch. Projecting annexes to the rear housed the sacristy, and built-in confessionals were also common. Some churches, like Laracompawn, included a gallery space above the entrance. Overall, these buildings demonstrate a gradual acceptance of simpler, more fluid and less ornate forms. The earliest church of the set, at Kiel from 1952, was completed in the plain, flat-roofed and cubic idiom that had been so characteristic of early international modernism. Though Boyd Barrett would return to this distinct horizontal style later at Castle Cove in 1961, it might have been considered too radical a first step. The majority of his churches therefore adopted a pitched roof profile, finding form in the simplicity of the Irish vernacular and seeking precedence in the past to gain acceptance. While some buildings disguised their modern means of construction behind layers of brick and plaster, the Kerry churches proudly display their structural discipline, using exposed concrete frames internally. A secondary structure of timber members held the roof aloft. Pushing the structure to the periphery of the aisles facilitated unobstructed views of the sanctuary, which was occasionally recessed in an alcove. Some churches, like the Black Valleys, also expressed this grid externally. Boyd Barrett's arched roof ribs are flat horizontal beams, add a sense of beauty, rhythm and order to the otherwise plain or unadorned interiors. He favoured a pointed triangular profile and abstracted geometry referencing nearby mountain peaks, but he experimented with more curvaceous forms in the immense arches which lined the nave at Moyvan, like the carcass of a great sea creature. This truthful architectural language was inspired by the functional simplicity of industrial buildings and reduced the expense needed in case the structure. Bell towers took on a variety of forms. At Kiel, a plain square tower stands proudly above the door, while a slender external belfry locks into one side of the entrance canopy at Larcompawn. Later churches, like Clonkeen, simplified the form further by subsuming the housing for the bells into the roof pitch itself. Moyvan's copper flesh, surmounting the red tile roof, is perhaps the most distinct. It combines bell tower and steeple into one, and towers symbolically over every other building in the village. It combines bell tower and steeple into one, and towers symbolically over every building in the village, and can be seen from many vantage points all over North Kerry. The churches shared a raw and simple material palette, which might appear clinical or Spartan by today's standards. This resulted of economic necessity, but also followed contemporary trends. The material excess and ornamentation of the past century have been abandoned in favour of the sharp, clean lines and organisational clarity of modernism. Ireland, a cement-rich country, had become self-sufficient in the production of concrete, just as the scarcity and rationing of the emergency had compelled architects and builders to innovate new construction methods. This material was cheaper than brick, or stone, and more versatile. Concrete, in block and render form, lent itself to modular construction and the stripped-down aesthetic of the modern age. Boyd Barrett had seen the success of concrete at Christ the King in Cork, and his Kerry churches would use these new structural techniques in abundance. The beams and arches which lined the nave were of reinforced concrete. Concrete was also used in the surrounding masonry cavity walls, in the screed floors, in the angled struts which support porch canopies, and in the precast window mullions at Kiel. The textural variations seen in Cork were abandoned due to the relative scaling down of the budget. Generally, the walls are finished in rough cast plaster, with contrasting areas of smooth render in horizontal bands, at plinth or eaves levels, and surrounding window openings. Internal materials were selected on a functional basis and were appropriate for their environments. Floors and skirting were finished in thermoplastic eco-tiles, or terrazzo, as these were hard-wearing surfaces which were durable and easily cleaned. In Kiel, mahogany was used for the altar rails and candles, a more practical choice than brass in the salty air of the South Kerry coast. The muted interiors allowed the richer colours and materials of the religious decor in the sanctuary to stand out. A Kerryman report from Kiel described its altar as a strikingly plain block of white marble, its severity relieved only by its panel of rich golden mosaic inlaid in the front. The vaulted canopies and ornamental screens around the altars, the reredos and baldachin, were constructed of timber studwork, which was clad in plaster marble. Elsewhere, simple and not overly ornate wrought iron was used in communion rails, screens and gates which were spread throughout the churches. A variety of clerestory leaded lights and stained glass window forms were explored across the schemes, some pointed, some arched, and others with square heads. Here at Shrone, the spectrum of hues, from blue to yellow, emphasises the rhythm of the structural grid. The largely restricted external palette was enhanced by the addition of natural stone in featured locations on the building's facades. The Sneck stonework and curving limestone queons, which enunciate the entrance of Foylmore, draw the visitor under the canopy and across the threshold. The use of these native and rugged materials combated the sense of the planar and alien which typified the interiors. Mosaics also decorated the entry hoods, such as this red, gold and white pattern at Kiel, the Mariner motif at Foylmore, and these early Christian symbols in blue and gold at Clonkeen. Boyd Barrett made a stylistic turn at the end of the decade. His later design for Castle Cove featured stone coverage across the entire facade. Reconstituted stone was used, mixing fragments of natural stone with cement to create a composition of varied hues of brown and grey. One visitor to Castle Cove noted that the new church has a pleasing rustic appearance, harmonising with the rugged countryside of mountain and sea. However, the Church of the Holy Spirit of Muckross boasts the most significant changes. Its large pitched roof plays with the ridgelines of Torc and Mangerton, which in their grandeur and ruggedness emphasise the pleasing outline of the new church. A central doorway, mosaic spandrel panel, and an abstracted stained glass window form a single recessed opening. For the first time, the stone cladding extends into the interior, where it contrasts with the teak doors and timber-clad ceiling above. Large rectangular windows line both sides of the nave, and minimalist fibrous plaster fluting forms a backdrop to the Pavonazan marble and limestone slab credence table. The deeper use of materiality at Muckross portrays the better financial standing of Killarney Parish, but also the improving wider economic conditions for Ireland in the 1960s. Boyd Barrett's approach here, at the final church in his Kerry campaign, also begins to recall what writer J.M. Richards has entitled New Empiricism, a strain of modernism evident in the work of Scandinavian architects like Aalto, Asplund and Leverance. These designers held a deep understanding of place and materiality, that buildings should settle into the landscape by incorporating local forms, patterns and craftsmanship into the architecture. This departure from the oblivious internationalism and universality of early modernism anticipated the impending and momentous transformation which would grip ecclesiastical architecture over the next decade. In 1963, Boyd Barrett was awarded the knighthood of the Order of St. Sylvester by Pope John XXIII, in recognition of his services to ecclesiastical architecture. It was perhaps the pinnacle of the architect's career, but in ways also marked the changing of the guard. Having been initially resistant to change, the Vatican convened an ecumenical council between 1962 and 1965 to readdress the relationship between the Church and the modern world. The Second Vatican Council, as it was known, did not impart detailed direction on church design, but reforms to religious rituals implied demand for new design solutions and new environments, which would reinforce this revolution. Amongst the most influential changes for architecture were more democratic sacraments, encouraging the active participation of the laity in the communal worship and celebration, the acceptance of contemporary styles and objects of artistic merit in sacred art, and the promotion of noble simplicity or humility and self-denial in the face of increasing materialism. Embracing Vatican II reforms, open and more flexible floor plans dismantled the physical and psychological barriers to participation. Communion rails and pulpits were removed, and the priest turned to face his community. The constraints tradition gave way to bold experimentation and striking variety in design, driven by the architect's vision as much as by church directive. Some of Ireland's most renowned and unique modern churches were completed in Kerry during this period of liberation, including Lee McCormick's Christ Prince of Peace in Fossa from 1977, and Michael Scott and Ronnie Talon's Corpus Christi for Knockanure in 1964. For Kerry, it also witnessed the end of outsourced work and the emergence of local and native architects, such as the work of D.J. Kennedy and Company at St. Bernard's in Abbeydorney from 1968. Boyd Barrett also came to embrace this seismic change. His final Cork Rosary Church, Our Lady Crowned Mayfield from 1962, broke from the neoclassicism of his earlier designs and boldly adopted an interlaced and pre-stressed concrete ceiling above an irregular and open cone-shaped plan. The Great Spatial Transformation acknowledged the new confidence and determination in Ireland's economy under the leadership of Sean O'Mass and T.J. Whitaker, as emigration slowed and foreign investment arrived on our shores. Ireland had truly begun its transformation from a cultural tradition to a culture of progress. Ultimately, the architecture that emerged in pre-Vatican II Kerry was perhaps not as idealistic or radical as the vision to build in this landscape. The revolution was brought back to reality by the constraints of economics or logistics and by the reservations of the time. Boyd Barrett's functional
but moderate and safe strain of modernism sought to appease the church and secure guaranteed work for his firm. And yet, there's no doubt that it helped to spread some of the formal language of modern architecture to rural Kerry. This allowed churches to be constructed in places that once might have been deemed impossible, and exposed people to a grandeur to which they were not accustomed. One parishioner commented that the opening of the church in Moyvan generated great curiosity. No one had ever seen a rose window in these parts before. The pride the local communities took in these buildings is strikingly clear. Parish priests were left dumbfounded and speechless at the heightened spaciousness of their prospective stations. The churches were also opened to great fanfare. The people in Moyvan recalled that the whole village was alive with activity, last-minute preparations. People painting, cleaning windows, people on ladders putting up bunting, hanging flags on telegraph poles. One sensed an air of great expectation and excitement. They believed that they had established a fitting legacy for the people and their traditions, with Father O'Sullivan of Moyvan exclaiming, "I have raised up a monument more lasting than bronze." Today, however, that question of legacy is cast into doubt. Amazingly, none of the 10 churches are registered on Ireland's National Inventory of Architectural Heritage. Modernist architecture was certainly not future-proof, and many of the buildings are in need of renovation to combat the impact of damp and deterioration over the last 70 years. We need to consider how we might conserve these physical artefacts and their embodied history for future generations, now, before it is too late. It has been suggested that Boyd's Barrett's buildings should be perceived as being timeless in their safe, unassertive design. I choose instead to see them as very much of their time. Just as Kerry's ancient landmarks remain as tangible markers of its early history, the buildings of the 20th century have the capacity to illustrate the society and culture of our modern times. I hope that this brief journey into the period has succeeded in awakening deeper awareness and appreciation of the lesser documented modern heritage which surrounds us, here in this little corner of Ireland. Thank you.